welcome to CDE Virtual. We're delighted that Cas Coovadia, CEO of Business Unity South Africa and a long-standing CDE board member, will open our discussion this evening. Cas, over to you.
Thank you for the opportunity for opening this session and giving me the opportunity to say a few words, both as CEO of BUSA and a founding member of the CDE. CDE's role is a multifaceted one. Primarily, it's doing a lot of work and has historically done a lot of work since our democratic dispensation to help consolidate our democracy through promoting inclusive growth that creates jobs and hopefully takes our country onto a path of prosperity for all our people. Over the 25 years of its existence, the CDE has developed a recognition as a national resource, both by business and government and other parts of civil society. And it's become the go-to place for critical thinking on economic growth, on societal development, on investment attraction, and so on. It engages broadly and was recently challenged by the Reverend Frank Chikane, who's a veteran of the anti-apartheid struggle, to see what role CDE could play to help change the trajectory of our country from, in his words, a wrong direction to a more constructive and productive path. And that demonstrates CDE's ability to actually interact with a broad range and a diverse range of people and interests. The board recently affirmed the value of a series that CDE has embarked on to bring together a global audience from different parts of society and a diverse range of critical thinkers from different parts of society. It is critical in not just in this country, but in, I think, the global sort of world has become less tolerant of diverse views and diverse thinking. And so it's critical to create a platform for diverse thought and action. This enables CDE to bring together global experts and leading South Africans not usually accessible to us. And I guess a positive occurrence of the COVID pandemic is that we are able to work virtually, and it has become easier to bring people from across the world together, and we become used to the virtual platform. So it's very effective and it's bringing us together. This evening, we look at the development of the middle class in developing countries, a critical topic that is important to the structure of developing country economies and societies, and we look forward to a discussion on this. Let me just end by saying that I have been very proud to be a member of the CDE board since its inception. I think the CDE has positioned itself very well in the discourse in our country and in helping to take our country onto a growth path that is sustainable and inclusive. And I'm sure CDE will continue for the foreseeable future to play that sort of a role. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cas, and especially for your words of support and your long-time commitment to the CDE. It's my privilege and pleasure to welcome our guest tonight. Nancy Birdsall is a legend in the development world and a key player in Washington. She is President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development, one of the world's leading and most effective development think tanks, an organization she founded in 1991. Prior to that, she spent time at the World Bank, at the Carnegie Endowment, and was an executive vice president at the Inter-American Development Bank for some 5 years. She is a member of the boards of numerous organizations, including the International Food Policy Council, the African Population and Health Research, organization, and she chaired the board for the International Council for Research on Women. 2 years ago, I was in Washington and attended an event at the prestigious Peterson Institute, where the governor of South Africa's Reserve Bank, our next guest, in fact, was receiving a very prestigious award. I walked into the large auditorium and then stopped. The hall was almost completely dominated by men. Now, I'm used to this in South Africa. It's not as bad now as it used to be, but I didn't expect it in Washington, D.C. in 2019. It's in this context that Nancy has been a pioneer of excellence and effectiveness. So Nancy, welcome to CDE. Welcome to South Africa. We're delighted to have you, if only on Zoom.
Thank you very much, Anne. And big congratulations to you on your 25th anniversary. Just to set the record straight, the Center for Global Development was founded in 2001. And this is important because we have not quite yet reached our 25th anniversary. And I have felt for a long time we were just coming along behind CDE in all the good things about making a difference, having impact in the world. So congratulations to you and to Cas Coovadia.
Well, thanks very much, Nancy. So let's jump in. I have a lot of issues to explore with one of the world's leading development researchers and policy thinkers. About 7 years ago, CDE, together with think tank partners in India and Brazil, undertook a large study on the middle classes of South Africa and those two countries. And across these countries, 3 major challenges were identified in which middle classes were seen to play a pivotal role. Growing a large and dynamic internal consumer market, reducing inequality and building a more stable social order, and strengthening the state's accountability and capacity to deliver. Now, many people on the left would say that this is the wrong lens through which to think about development. They would say we should much rather focus on society's ability to help the poorest of the poor or the working class. So Nancy, why are middle classes so important for development in your view?
Well, thank you, Anne. I think it's great that you chose thinking about the middle class and why it matters for this webinar. I think the simple answer is that in order to address the needs of the poor and see poverty reduced, including via healthy growth, it just turns out that it helps to have a vital middle class that has the capacity to do 2 things because it is middle class, let's say middle class. So first is people can pay taxes that create the capacity, financial capacity at least, for a government to educate its people, including the poor, and provide health care, so on. And second, the middle class is more likely than the poor to provide accountability or to insist on accountability from the government. So, you know, I think it's too extreme to say you need the middle class to make progress on poverty, but it's not too extreme to say it helps to have a middle class in order for a government to make progress on poverty and even on reducing inequality. All other things the same.
So let me probe a little bit. How does a middle class hold governments accountable? Why are they more likely to promote the rule of law and things like that in a developing country?
Well, the middle class thrives on a level playing field where there are not insider privileges, for example, on that the rich share, sometimes with people in politics and in government. The middle class is, we know in the world, is likely to have secondary education, or people that have had at least secondary education. And so they, I'd say, are more demanding from government, make demands, and don't like it when government cheats, right? So it's all related. It's a circle in which the middle class benefits from a fair game out there, from a good investment climate, and from steady growth, frankly. It benefits from a society in which workers, and not just the investment class, are getting a just return to their efforts.
Now, I'm not sure that you've kept up with Brazil, but let me ask this question. In 2014, partly inspired by the work that you had done, CDE organized a roundtable on the middle class in Sao Paulo, Brazil. At the time, there was a lot of optimism about the rising middle class in Brazil, with politicians and others claiming 40 million new people in the middle class, resulting in a population overall that was 50% middle class, nearly 98 million out of 200 million Brazilians. At the time, quite a few Brazilian economists were skeptical about these numbers and their sustainability. And I think with hindsight, it looks like they might have been right. Do you keep up with Brazil? How do you see the situation in Brazil now? And did this middle class materialize, and has it been sustained?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical in a country like Brazil that, or it's very important to recognize that the middle class growth in that period in Brazil, culminating around 2014-15, had been the result of very strong growth on average for 10 or 15 years. In the sense that it was dependent on growth, a slowdown in growth is a problem. People get more unhappy when their expectations have been raised and then they're crushed. So the problem in countries like Brazil, and probably even South Africa now, is that with the general slowdown around the world in growth after a healthy period, it's interesting that emerging markets like South Africa and Brazil, you recovered rather well after the global financial crisis, better than the rich country, faster and better than the rich countries. So, by the middle of the 2010s, we had the headlines about rising Africa, big middle class emerging in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So it helps to have had a middle class for a long enough period that people are more confident, right? And less likely to be unhappy. I mean, I think the other way to think about it is a middle class that's dependent on a paycheck, right? Or a steady income, a steady, secure income, is always going to be fragile in the face of a recession. Look at what happened to the middle class in the US in the 1930s, or look at what happened to the middle class in Germany when the Nazis, which led to the Hitler and the Nazis, which was, dramatic, troubles and loss of savings with huge inflation. So I'd say the characteristic of the middle class is that a middle class household can manage household shocks, an illness in the family, you know, the house burns down, it's likely to have insurance, et cetera, et cetera. But the lower middle class certainly is vulnerable to economy-wide recessions and to global slowdowns in a globalized system more and more. Not sure I answered your question, but there you go.
That's fine. That's fine. I'm going to probe a bit more on the middle class. In one of your articles, you pointed out that between 1990 and 2015, around 1 billion people escaped poverty around the world, including about 650 million people in China and India. And during the same period, some 900 million people entered the $10 a day middle class. What do you think are the implications of this? What does it mean for a society to move so many people out of poverty and with such speed? How does the society change?
Yeah, well, I mean, that goes to the heart of what is a middle-class society, right? I think first thing I'd say is big distinction between China and India. China now has 60–70% of its people surely in what I call the middle class in developing countries, which implies about $10 a day per capita. So, you know, that's an annual income in US dollars of about, in say, a 3-person household of $14,000 a year. So it's not a huge amount, but it's well above what many countries in Africa enjoy today. And India is more like Africa. It's a little bit hard to put China and India together. I doubt that I did that. I think it comes from the fact that there was a period when there was a lot of hype about the growing middle class in India because India's economy was growing very rapidly. But the middle class in India is still very small. Maybe if you define the middle class as $10 a day or more, it could be 10% of the population in India. The thing is that from a producer point of view in the rest of the world, producing consumer goods, for example, 10% of the population of India is a lot of people, right? So that's where, in my view, some of the hype came from. Now we can sell small cars in India. Maybe we should be manufacturing ourselves more small cars in India. Now the demand for energy is going to increase in India, and so on and so on. So China and India are very different. I think what happened in China is just extraordinary, but it's just another example of how growth is a good thing. If you want a bigger middle class, even where the distribution of income is fairly low or poor, as in Brazil, with growth, you get a bigger middle class and you get more people moving out of poverty into this group of people that I call the strugglers between the truly poor and the middle class. And I think it's that group that the development system or the development zeitgeist somehow has failed to pay enough attention to, as not enough attention. With all the attention on the poor, a lot of people in my country are just confused, you know, about what development is about. So it's more about growth, frankly, and developing a group of people emerging who are investors as well as consumers, small investors, and who make their government responsive to their needs and their demands.
That's an important set of issues. I'm going to come back to that. You've said that the size of the middle class, when it comes to the middle class, size matters, but it's not everything. what did you mean by that? What were you saying that's not just about size?
Until you get the middle class to at least 50 or 60% of the population, the problem is, it's fragile in the face of economy-wide or global-wide recessions or slowdowns in growth.
Let's talk a bit more about the strugglers, as you've called them. You've said that a lot of people, as you said earlier, from the Asian Development Bank to the African Development Bank, or some very prominent economists, talk too glibly about the middle class, and that it really matters whether you're living on $2 a day or $10 a day. Tell us a bit more about how you see this and why this is so important to make this distinction and what it means for policy.
Yes, I like this question. Most people in the developing world who are not counted among the poor, and now in the world, we are down to very, well, I shouldn't say low numbers, but, a huge reduction in poverty, thanks to China especially. But most people in the developing world, probably 70 or 80% of people are in households where income is between $2 and $10 a day per capita. And at $5 a day per capita, based on research in Latin America, the chances that a household will fall back down to lower incomes, if not all the way to $2 a day and less, but will fall back, are 50% over 3 or 4 years. And at $3 a day, they're higher. And what's important about $10 a day, at least in the Latin America context, which in many ways is not unlike South Africa, is that when a household reaches $10 a day per capita, it's more secure, at least from a material point of view. And that $10 a day per capita is associated in Latin America with at least one adult having secondary education and at least one adult having a paycheck, a pay stub, a regular, relatively secure income. Relatively secure, except in the case of a big recession or an overall slowdown. So the remarks about the hype about the middle class in Africa and elsewhere came in around 2014-15. I think there was one week when The Economist had Rising Africa on its cover. You probably know better. And I would guess that was in that period. And a lot has happened since 2015. I think, 2015 was also the Addis Ababa financing for development conference with all sorts of goals set by the G7 and the G20 and about how much should be spent. And a lot has happened since then that has made all that less, it just didn't happen in quite the same way. So I hope I've come a little bit at. Oh, the other thing I'd say about the strugglers is that almost all strugglers work in the informal sector. So their income is less certain. It is much more fragile. In Latin America, they're likely to have finished primary school, but not more. They don't have paychecks the way you and I do. Right. They rely day to day. So, one way of thinking of it is this group of people are really hit by COVID, really badly hit, because they probably have loss of employment. Many of them are in, street selling, retail, informal production, which is highly dependent on other people's consumption. So what we have not learned as economists is how to minimize informality, which is very hard to do, and how to do the sorts of technical support that would increase productivity of people in the informal sector, how to do training programs that reach people in the informal sector that actually are worthwhile. Those sorts of issues at the micro level we're weak in the developments industry or aid industry.
Right. So in this context, one of your comments is that for most people, losing ground is more troubling than never gaining it, in a sense, that this phenomenon of dashed expectations is something that you're really concerned about. Talk to us a little bit about this.
Yes, I think this is a huge problem and has been with the slowdowns due to COVID and the loss of employment in informal activities due to COVID. All that is bad news. And overall, a lot of people in developing countries who are in this struggler group were accustomed for much of the early 21st century. They got used to the idea things were getting better. And it's also true in the US now. We have a struggling middle class, and we have a lot of people which, Angus Deaton and Ann Keyes wrote this book, Deaths of Despair. Many of your listeners may know that book. And it's a group of mostly white people, mostly men, who have lost all hope that things will get better. And so, as happened in the Soviet Union, actually, in the early 90s, we have rising levels of, alcohol abuse, suicide, drug abuse, and so on. And they're people that have just basically dropped out because they have a complete loss of hope for themselves. And what might be interesting to listeners in South Africa is that a colleague of mine, Carol Graham, who's at Brookings, has done great work recently indicating that in the US, Blacks are much less likely in the same income category as whites at sort of low levels, working class, struggling. They're much less likely to be suffering despair. Much less likely. They want their children to go beyond high school to college, whereas the children of this group of whites who are very discouraged and kind of lost, they discourage their high school male graduates anyway from going on to college. So, I think that's something that might be interesting in South Africa, to the extent that things are getting better for Blacks than they were in the apartheid era. Although now it's been quite some time, but you could hope that Blacks are more resilient to dashed expectations than the group of whites who have been at lower income, working class, are likely to be. And in these circumstances of the last 4 or 5 years, including the COVID year of loss of jobs and income everywhere.
Right. A very interesting finding. I want to bring you back to jobs and the developing world, and the whole question of automation and kind of digitization and the impact this is going to have on jobs for low-skilled people. You've made a comment once where you said that you thought that in the context of poverty and the desperate hunt for jobs, this is not as big a priority in the developing world as a lot of people are talking about. So what is your view on this? There's a lot of hype about all of this. Where do you stand on how to think about this if you're a developing country?
Right. Well, I guess I'd say first, I'm the typical economist who is more optimistic that automation and digitization will make us all better off and more productive. And maybe it would be a great blessing if everybody could work in the modern formal sectors around the world for 30 hours a week instead of 40 hours a week. This is something Keynes, as many of your listeners might know, predicted almost 100 years ago. So that there could be a shorter work week when we are all more or less, on average, more productive. So I'm not as concerned, you know, it just doesn't, maybe it's because I'm a development economist and it just doesn't get me as exercised, the worry about job loss, which I don't think we've actually seen yet in real terms. So it's all about what will happen in the future. It's a little bit like the worry about globalization and what will it do, particularly in developing countries. It turns out globalization, it's hard to say it has not been a good thing for the developing world, which is why it's the developing countries that have pushed back on trade restriction, you know, changing the rules of the game on trade and investment. And so I assume that that's been the case for your group of BRICS and other middle-income countries, much more keen on continuing and managing globalization better than the politics it dictates in the US and France and Britain and so on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think trade has been great for most developing countries, and the more the better. It's a bit of a complicated issue in South Africa at the moment. There's a big push for localization, but that will take us in a different direction. I want to bring you back to economics, and you have argued that to avoid the worst outcomes, countries with emerging middle classes cannot take shortcuts. And I think you were talking about economic policy. What did you mean? What are you thinking of shortcuts versus what you might recommend?
Sometimes in Latin America, the tradition has been a shortcut is industrialize at home and minimize competition from outside.
Right.
Maybe that was the context.
Did that work in Latin America, or what's your view on that?
Well, we're going back now, right, many years into the mid-20th century. You know, I think in Brazil, it worked for a while, but then it didn't work anymore. You reach a limit, even if it did work for a while. The ISI, what did that stand for? Substitutes and blah, blah, blah. It certainly didn't work in the face of huge macro shocks like oil prices, right, in the 70s. And what were the other big shocks? And growth debt. So, you know, economists have been arguing about this for many years, but I think the consensus is pretty strong now that sort of general lessons of a liberal style economics are good, and you can't have shortcuts. Even China is showing that you can't have special treatment for a few years. Not that I would argue against infant industry concepts, but you have to build in from the beginning, this is going to disappear gradually. Maybe we'll have a tariff, but then it'll disappear. It'll come down gradually over time.
Right. Let me turn to Thomas Piketty and his book on capital in the 21st century. And one of the points you made was that for poorer countries, the challenge is not the one that Piketty outlines about modern capitalism generating inequality, but for poorer countries or developing countries, the challenge is building a capable state. Can you talk about this and your thinking on this? And
yes, I mean, I think that I remember is in an article that is a review of Piketty's book from the point of view of a development economist. So I was saying, you know, let's not think about all the detailed and really interesting argument and debate about Piketty's fundamental formula and its fundamental point, which is that growth really in the developed world, in capitalist systems, generates inequality. I wouldn't argue with that at all. I was just trying to say it's not the basic problem that developing countries face. The basic problem, if you really try to hone down, is effective government. And that takes me back to, you know, the benefits of a middle class. There are many things that can interrupt those benefits, heaven knows. I mean, China has a big middle class now, but lots of political issues and lots of lack of certain freedoms that we treasure in the liberal capitalist world, right? Argentina has a long history with a relatively large middle class of dashed expectations, leading to sort of the Peronist and populist style governments as a reaction. So yeah, it's complicated, but I think for most of the people in the world who are in developing countries, income inequality is fundamentally a problem because you get a rich insider privileged class and then too small a middle class to demand a level playing field, and it's a level playing field that in the long run is better for the very poor to grow out of poverty. So you have a sort of vicious cycle there. That's the way I prefer to think of the benefits of the middle class. It's not a magic solution. It doesn't solve everything. Many things can create problems, even with a vital middle class. Venezuela is a great example. It had oil, that was its problem, right? South Africa had apartheid and still has, no doubt, a lot of issues around discrimination. That's a big problem. That prevents many members of the middle class from wanting to contribute to the public commons, right? Seeing education and healthcare as, if it's pushed as benefiting the poor and the Blacks, there will be groups of people who don't like that. That's our problem in the US, very much, historically.
Yeah, I think it's different in South Africa today. We have obviously a majority Black population, many of whom have not had the massive expansion of opportunities that one would have hoped post-apartheid, through bad education and through an economy that hasn't really grown as much as it should, and not in a labor-intensive way. So it's kind of complicated here in ways that are different from America. But certainly that we need an effective state is absolutely vital. I've often thought that one could put a libertarian who doesn't want the state in the middle of a South African township in the middle of the night, and we'd soon see their need for a more effective state and policing, and I think would change some people's views rather quickly. Let me move on. Well, before we leave this, let me just push you a bit harder on globalization. There's been a big pushback in the rich world about globalization and growing inequality and so on. On the other hand, I think you and I probably would agree that globalization has led to enormous opportunities for millions and millions of people in poorer countries that they've never had before. And that's, you've talked a bit about this, why developing countries should be in favor of more trade, more globalization. We touched on it earlier. I just wondered if you wanted to add to that. From a developing country perspective, why globalization is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that occurs to me is with COVID, the supply chain problems, which are sort of the opposite of what we think of as globalization, right? That have occurred because of restrictions on imports in the rich countries, say, I mean, restrictions on exports, actually, the export of the vaccine being an example, not restrictions, but reluctance in that case to do what needs to be done, or continue to be advocates, not in the general sense of what is globalization, but in the specific sense of open markets and not having restrictions on developing country exports, but also, maybe economists, maybe development people, maybe people like you and me, and we should be redefining globalization to take into account the need for more effective addressing of the global commons problems. That might be a setting in which more people would understand why it's good to have cooperation. It's good to have multilateral action. Just the climate issue, and of course the vaccine and the COVID issue, are the obvious day-to-day now examples. So that gives me a thought to mull over a little bit. There's more to globalization than trade and, workers.
Right.
And tariffs. And certainly now that's true. I think the next stage of globalization will have to do with sort of shared approach to certain regulatory standards and a shared approach to addressing the commons problem at the global level.
That's going to be hard, but
it is hard. We see that already. Look at my own country. Just today, more discussion of boosters, when what percentage of people in Africa have had a first dose vaccine of a vaccine? It's 3 or 4%.
Very low.
So,
well, a more capable state would help if we if we had them. I'm going to take you in a different direction. I want to probe your thinking on two other issues before we close. The one is about education reform. And you've talked, you've said that there are two things to prioritize if you're serious about education reform. The first is that for political leaders and education officials to actually recognize the depth of the problem. And so my first question is, how do you do that? Have you seen any countries do that? How do we persuade people who don't seem to care very much that the depth of this problem really matters if we're going to provide opportunities for millions of people who don't get a quality education?
Well, I think I feel as though there's been more attention in a good way to education in the last 5 or 6 years. Maybe because of Sustainable Development Goals, maybe because of Gordon Brown, who's, very, very focused and has been for many years on education. And maybe because there's an increasing recognition of the financing problem, because it's just not that much money is spent on education in developing countries. And it's a little bit that vicious circle. There aren't enough taxpayers able to do indirectly through tax paying financing when you have a lot of poor people and strugglers and a small middle class. So that's I think political leaders, I must have been referring to in developing countries, don't recognize the depth of the problem, and that may have been a reference to, it's not just about more kids spending more time in school, it's the depth of the problem has to do with the quality of schooling.
Yeah.
And whether children are learning anything. And the numbers there for Africa are really shocking, really troubling, even in South Africa. And there are a lot of academics who work hard on education that are trying to sort out why that is. What is it that is going wrong? I think some of it, this goes, I think also whatever I was saying about education reform was in the context of the aid system, where I'm still a big proponent of what we called cash on delivery aid, which is simply donors make a contract with South Africa. Although South Africa is hard because it's not that dependent on aid.
We don't get a lot of aid, but it would be in the country. I wanted to ask you about your cash on delivery concept and how you could do that.
Right, so it would be within the country. So somehow the central government would have issue, a contract that it could hold a province or a region or an urban area to, that says when X number of children, X percentage of children finish primary school and get on a standardized test, competence, when they demonstrate competence in reading and math and so on, equivalent to a primary school education by a well understood known test. When you do that, or when you add to the proportion of children that pass some sort of test, we'll pay you X amount from the central government to the state government or the city government. $100 per child or $10 per child additional. And that's a simple contract. And the benefits of that is it clarifies who bears responsibility, in the case of South Africa, at the local level, right? It also might inspire some innovation that people could take ownership of, right? It might inspire low-cost interventions, and there's a big literature on low-cost interventions that are useful. Have women in the town with secondary education who are not working help out 5 hours a week with the children who can't read yet in 5th and 6th grade. We know from work of our Nobel Prize winners, in India, that do randomized controlled trials, that kind of thing can make a huge difference. So.
Great. Nancy, I can't let you go without talking a little bit about women.
Good.
And I want, I sometimes think this is the biggest revolution the world is going through, trying to opening up opportunities for women to become equal citizens. Unfortunately, not in a lot of countries in the world, but certainly South Africa's constitution and a lot of other places. And you've talked about contraception as the single most important technology for development, that it liberates women to think ahead, as men have always been able to do. Can you talk a bit about how you see all of this and your views on what's emerging, what's important? Yeah.
Well, I really I'm thankful to you for that question and for finding that bit of whatever I've said, because I think, a lot of what we've talked about on expectations and strugglers in middle class has been about people's ability and willingness, capacity to plan for the future. And when we don't have, that ability if you're a 10-year-old girl or a 13-year-old girl, and you don't even know that you have choices about your future. You live in a context in which your future seems predefined. You'll get married to somebody, and that's kind of it. In too many societies and countries around the developing world. So that's the sense in which the concept of family planning, the access to contraception, just having the choice, just having the possibility can change the way the 10 and 15-year-old think, you know? And we've seen that happening where some 15-year-olds are pushing back and saying, I don't want to marry this old guy that my parents chose, because it will close off options. So this has to do with fundamental issues like agency. And I think that if we think about contraception as the key thing that makes life in terms of planning for a future the same for girls as for boys. It's not complicated, right? So many things influence girls and boys. Norms, I'm doing research on that now. Does it matter if you live in a town where several older women are working in the formal sector and bringing home a salary? Does that matter? Just seeing that in your environment? In a small town, you know, in Malawi? Does it matter in South Africa when you see women like you know, who are public figures? Wow, how did that happen? She must have gotten a lot of education and had a lot of options. So trying to understand the extent to which that kind of implicit norm, that how I call it the reproductive choice ecosystem. What's out there when you're a 10-year-old girl in a village in Africa? What do you see as your possibilities?
Great, really interesting. You also wrote an article with a very provocative title of Globalism and Wife Beating, if you recall. And South Africa has to deal with an unbelievably high and terrible rate of violent attacks on women. What have you found out in that research, and any global insights that might be helpful for us about violence against women, or this article?
This comes from the demographic and health surveys that are very, much common now still in Africa and other developing countries, where women are asked questions. I can't remember exactly what connection I was making to globalism, other than the spread of ideas, right? I mean, an amazing phenomenon of the Me Too movement that started, I mean, what's triggered it in the US? I don't remember if it's Jeffrey Epstein or what, but it was like, it just spread to developing countries. I mean, all over India, almost. That's the benefit of the internet, and maybe globalism as the spread of ideas on the globe. So the concept of globalism for me is about not just globalization at all, but when more of us think of ourselves as global citizens, we'll have more attention to climate and more money and more attention to issues like wife beating, because women don't want to live in a world where their female colleagues have a high probability of living in a culture where, even if, and I suspect this was part of what I was talking about, even if in your own household, wife beating is a no-no. You think that it's okay, and you think that it's seen as okay in other households. That's bad. It has to be that everyone recognizes there's some sort of global standard around the rights of women.
Right, right. Well, I think that's a great place to end. We've come to the end of our hour. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your insights and thoughts on the middle classes and other topics. And I'm sure everyone's found it as interesting as I did and fascinating. Thank you so much, Nancy. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you to you, Anne. I think you did better reading of some of my works than I have done over time. It goes back too far, maybe.
Well, we learned a lot just reading. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
A delight.
Good night, everybody. This conversation's over. Thank you.
Congratulations to you.
Thank you very much. Bye.